Buddhism. The founder of Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama, probably around the year 563 to 483 BCE, called the Buddha or the Enlightened One by his followers, is believed to have abandoned a life of princely luxury at age 29 and to have set out to discover the cause of human suffering and misery and its spiritual remedy. He tried various spiritual paths, including extreme asceticism and mortification of the flesh, but he did not find these conducive to spiritual insight, eventually obtaining enlightenment while seated in meditation beneath a Bodhi tree. He shortly after preached his first sermon just outside the city of Sarnath. The rest of his life was spent in meditation, preaching, and guiding his followers. Buddhism, unlike Jainism, spread to Burma, Cambodia, China, Japan, Korea, Laos, Nepal, and Thailand, although it declined in India and by the 13th century was virtually extinct there. Today, there are about 350 million followers of Buddhism. And if you'd like, there is a longer playlist concerning Buddhism, and in our philosophy playlist, there is a playlist on Chinese philosophy as well as Indian philosophy. At present, there are two main schools of Buddhism, Mahayana and Hinayana, or also known as Theravada. The doctrine of Theravada Buddhism, the doctrine of the elders, is generally believed to represent the original Buddhist teachings, but from another of the early sects, a school developed that gave itself the name of Mahayana Buddhism, meaning the greater vehicle, and referred to Theravada Buddhism and related schools as Hinayana Buddhism, the lesser vehicle. The religious ideal of Hinayana Buddhism is the Arahat, the person who has achieved nirvana and escaped the cycle of rebirth. In contrast, the religious ideal of the Mahayana school is the Bodhisattva, the person who vows to postpone entrance into nirvana, although deserving it, until all others become enlightened and liberated. The term Bodhisattva, not to confuse it with the song by Steely Dan, is also used to refer to a class of celestial beings who were worshipped. In addition to advocating a spiritual ideal different from that of the original Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, in its latter development, became more metaphysical. In this latter development, the historical Buddha, Gautama, is simply one among many historical incarnations of the cosmic Buddha nature, the metaphysical absolute. This cosmic Buddha nature is portrayed as working in all ages and in innumerable worlds for the liberation of all sentient beings. No one disputes that Buddhism in all its forms is a religion, but as in the case of Jainism, there is disagreement among religious scholars over whether Buddhism is atheistic in nature. To be sure, it is not disputed that belief in a god or God is a part of Mahayana Buddhism. The numerous bodhisattvas, the Buddha Amitabha, and the cosmic Buddha nature seem to be like the gods or god of Western religion. That is disputed, and that is not disputed, but what is disputed is whether original Buddhism was atheistic, or what amounts to the same thing, whether Theravada Buddhism, which is generally recognized to be close to the original Buddhism, is atheistic. The standard orthodox interpretation is that Theravada Buddhism is atheistic. Thus, Herbert Stroop tells us that Buddhism is more accurately described as atheist than as theist. And Royston Pike asserts that Buddhism in its original form maintained no belief in God. And Ninian Smart holds that in Theravada Buddhism, which he considers most likely to represent the basic teaching of the Buddha, there is no belief in God, nor even a divine absolute. The standard interpretation has been challenged, however, by Helmuth von Glassenapp, who argues that old Buddhist texts confirm unmistakably and authoritatively that since the oldest times Buddhists believe in the existence of gods, or devas, that is, the finite and impermanent gods of the Hindu religion. However, the power of these gods, or devas, is limited. Von Glassenapp says, to the fulfillment of worldly petitions, to create the world, to change its order, to bestow a good rebirth on the suppliant, or to grant him liberation, is not within their power. Furthermore, these gods are subject to birth and death, according to Glassenap. Besides granting worldly petitions, devas proclaim the Buddha glory. Essentially, he suggests that devas or gods serve the same function as angels and saints in Christian and Islamic theological thought. He also draws parallels between them and, for example, Roman, Viking, and ancient Indian gods. Von Glassenap claims that Buddhism has no permanent gods of the sort associated with the Hebrew Christian tradition. In particular, he argues that Buddhism rejects any idea of God as creator. He points out that Buddhist philosophers, like Jainist philosophers, have developed arguments that attempt to refute the idea of a creator God. Thus, for example, the earliest Buddhist literature is said to emphasize the incompatibility of the idea of a good and almighty God with both evil in the world and the doctrine of freedom of will. Some modern Buddhists argue that if the world is traced back to God as the single cause, one must ask the further question, from what cause has God arisen? Other Buddhist thinkers have pointed out that different schools of religious thought regard different gods as the creator of the world, but these philosophers also ask whose opinion is correct. Still, other Buddhist philosophers maintain that if God's decision is the sole cause of the world, then the world was created at one time, but they argue things often arise in succession. These and other arguments, at least some of which are also put forward by Western skeptics, have also been used by Buddhist philosophers to refute the idea that a theistic creator God exists. Jamshed K. Fosdar has launched an even more radical challenge to the orthodox atheistic interpretation of original Buddhism. He argues that it is virtually and vitally important to understand Buddhism within the context of the Hindu tradition. So understood, Buddha was a reformer of the Hindu religion and not a creator of a new religion. Using textual analysis of Buddhist and Hindu documents, he argues that Buddha believed not only in devas, which were gods, but in the uncreated, the unborn, the unoriginated, in short, the absolute of the Hindu religion. Fosdar maintains that the absolute, or God, is the ultimate reality that lies behind nirvana and the laws of karma. What Buddha was opposed to, he says, was not belief in God, but belief in an anthropomorphic personal God, whom one can understand in human terms and speak about using common sense notions. In contrast, the absolute, or God, for Buddha was beyond all comprehension and could be understood only in an ineffable mystic state. Thus, Fosdar not only opposes the orthodox atheistic interpretation of Buddhism, he also maintains that the interpretations by the Buddhist philosophers referred to above, who argue against the absolute, or God, are based on a misunderstanding of Buddha's original teaching. Even if Fosdar and von Glassenap are correct in their interpretations of original Buddhism, it must not be supposed that Buddhists today all understand Buddhism in this way. Some Buddhists reject the old myths and superstitions of the traditional teachings on the grounds that they are incompatible with contemporary experience and science. But given this contemporary and scientific view, the gods or devas of original Buddhism have to be rejected as well. In addition, some Buddhists today even reject a literal interpretation of rebirth, but then it seems quite possible for Buddhism to be interpreted in an atheistic way, even when atheism is understood broadly. And we must also remember that in Christianity, most of its adherents today believe that Jesus claimed that he was God. Although if we look at it from a historical standpoint in the Gospels, Jesus never claimed that he was God. In conclusion, if von Glassenap is correct that belief in devas, the impermanent gods borrowed from Hinduism, was originally part of Buddhism, then Buddhism is not an atheistic religion in the broad sense. Although these gods play no role in the Buddhist path to salvation manifested in the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, on von Glassenap's interpretation, they were a part of the Buddhist worldview from the very beginning. Further, although devas or gods have no role in the creation of the universe and function only within it, they are divine beings nevertheless, with powers to grant certain prayers. Because it posits the existence of devas or gods, original Buddhism cannot be considered an atheistic religion in the broad sense of the term. However, on von Glassenap's interpretation, Buddhism is an atheistic religion in the narrow sense of the term. Indeed, in this sense, it, like Jainism, is a positive atheistic religion based on rational arguments. And as we have seen, the Buddhist intellectual tradition provides reasons not only for not believing in a theistic God, but for disbelieving in one. But what about the thesis that original Buddhism posits a belief in the absolute? If this interpretation is correct and it goes all the way back to the Hindu text, then whether or not early Buddhism is atheistic in the narrow sense depends on whether the notion of an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing personal God, who is the creator of the universe, is considered anthropomorphic. If it is, then even on Fosdar's interpretation, Buddhism is atheistic in the narrow sense of the term. And we'll just conclude with that.